The living room is filled with sunlight and the sound of two children laughing, and honestly everything looks perfect in that moment because the marble floors are gleaming and the massive windows are letting in that warm Texas afternoon glow, and little Emma, who is only 5, is chasing her 8-year-old brother Jake around the couch while their golden retriever Max watches them with those soft patient eyes that only a dog who truly loves his family can have. And then suddenly, Max freezes, and I mean completely freezes, like someone pressed pause on a remote, and his ears go flat and his body goes stiff and a low growl starts rumbling deep in his chest, and the kids don't notice because they're still laughing and playing, but Max is locked onto something near the floor near the edge of the room near the base of the tall indoor plant that sits in the corner, and if you follow his gaze you'll see it too, and your stomach will drop because there it is sliding slowly silently across the cold marble floor, a snake, and not just any snake but a western diamondback rattlesnake with those unmistakable diamond-shaped patterns running down its thick coiled body, and it's moving with purpose toward the warmth, toward the sound, toward the children, and Emma takes a step backward toward the corner, still giggling, still completely unaware, and Max steps forward, placing himself directly between her tiny bare feet and the snake, and from the hallway you hear the father, Richard, shouting something about a phone call, but his voice cuts off mid-sentence because he sees it too, and in that second everything changes and you know right then that something terrible is about to happen. But let me take you back because you need to understand how we got here and why this moment matters so much more than just a random accident, because nothing about this was random at all. Richard Davenport is the kind of man most people only read about in magazines, and he built his tech empire from nothing, growing up in a small town outside of Austin and working his way through college and eventually creating software that changed how hospitals manage patient data, and now he lives in a gated estate in the Texas Hill Country on 20 acres of pristine land with a mansion that has more rooms than most apartment buildings and security systems that cost more than most people's houses, and he has everything money can buy, but the thing he loves most is his family, and after his wife Sarah passed away 3 years ago from cancer, Richard became both mother and father to Jake and Emma, and he poured everything into them, and the one constant, the one thing that helped them all heal was Max, a golden retriever they adopted as a puppy just 6 months after Sarah's funeral, and Max became more than a pet, he became a guardian, a companion, a living piece of comfort for two children who lost their mother too young, and Richard trusted Max with his kids more than he trusted any nanny or security guard, because dogs don't lie and dogs don't pretend, and Max loved those children with every fiber of his being. Now here's where things start to shift, because about 2 weeks before this day Richard had a landscaping crew come out to expand the outdoor patio area, and they moved a lot of rocks and dug up a lot of earth near the back of the property, and if you know anything about the Texas Hill Country you know that when you disturb the land you disturb what lives beneath it, and rattlesnakes don't like being disturbed, and when their habitat is disrupted they go looking for new shelter, and sometimes that shelter happens to be a cool shaded mansion with climate control and plenty of dark corners, and nobody warned Richard about this because why would they? And Richard believed his estate was secure because the gates were tall and the cameras were everywhere and the alarm systems were top of the line, but nature doesn't care about your net worth and nature doesn't ask permission, and somewhere in those 2 weeks a snake found its way inside, probably through a gap near the patio door, or a crack near the foundation, and it settled into the shadows waiting. Earlier that morning Max had been acting strange and Richard noticed it but didn't think much of it because dogs have weird days sometimes just like people do, and Max kept pacing near the patio doors and sniffing along the baseboards, and he refused to eat his breakfast, which was unusual because Max loved food more than anything except the kids, and at one point Max stood at the bottom of the grand staircase and barked 3 sharp barks at nothing, at absolutely nothing, and Jake laughed and said, "Max is seeing ghosts again," and Emma giggled and hugged him, and Richard smiled and told Max to relax and that everything was fine, but everything was not fine, and Max knew it, and dogs have senses we will never fully understand, and Max could smell something wrong in that house, and he tried to warn them in the only way he knew how, but humans don't always listen, and Richard went back to his home office to finish a call, and the kids went back to playing, and Max stayed close watching, waiting with every muscle in his body tense because he knew, and he waited. Now we're back to that moment in the living room, and the snake is fully visible now, coiled slightly near the base of the potted plant, and its head is lifted just a few inches off the ground, and its tongue is flicking, tasting the air, and its rattle hasn't started yet, which means it's not in full defense mode yet, but it's aware and it's watching, and Emma takes another step backward, still not seeing it, and her little foot is maybe 3 feet away from the snake, and Max doesn't hesitate because There's no time to hesitate and he moves forward, positioning his body directly between Emma and the danger, and Richard is running now, shouting the kids' names, and Jake sees the snake for the first time and screams, and the scream startles Emma, who turns and finally sees it and freezes, and in that frozen second the snake decides it's threatened and it coils tighter and strikes, and at the exact same moment Max lunges, and the dog's movement is faster than the strike, and Max puts his muzzle, his body directly in the path, and the fangs that were aimed at Emma's ankle sink instead into the side of Max's neck, and you can hear the contact and you can see Max jerk and yelp and stumble, but even as the venom enters his bloodstream he doesn't back away, he keeps growling, keeps positioning himself between the snake and the children, and Richard grabs both kids and pulls them behind the couch, and the snake recoils and slithers toward the corner, and Max collapses, but his eyes never leave that snake, and his growl never stops even though it's getting weaker, and Jake is screaming and Emma is crying, and Richard is yelling into his phone because someone from his security team is calling emergency services and animal control, and everything is chaos, but in the middle of that chaos Max is still protecting because that's what he does and that's who he is. The next few minutes feel like hours, and Richard is kneeling beside Max, and the dog's breathing is already changing and the bite area is swelling, and Max's legs are twitching and he whimpers, but when Emma cries out Max lifts his head just slightly as if to say, "I'm still here, I'm still watching," and Richard feels something crack open inside his chest because he realizes what just happened, and he realizes what almost happened, and if Max hadn't moved in that exact second his daughter would have been bitten, and a rattlesnake bite on a 5-year-old could be fatal, and Max knew, and Max didn't think about himself, and Max just acted, and now Max might die because of it, and that thought hits Richard like a truck and he can't breathe, and the paramedics arrive first and then animal control arrives, and they find the snake still in the corner and they capture it and secure it, and one of the responders says it's a big one, probably 4 feet long and definitely venomous, and Richard just stares. Because 4 feet of death was in his living room and his children were 3 feet away and his dog saved them. The emergency veterinary hospital is 20 minutes away, and Richard breaks every speed limit getting there, and Jake sits in the backseat holding Max's paw, and Emma can't stop crying, and Richard keeps looking in the rearview mirror at Max lying still on the seat, and he whispers, "Hold on, buddy, just hold on, because he cannot lose this dog, not now, not like this, not after everything this family has already lost." And when they arrive the vet team rushes Max into the back and Richard is told to wait, and waiting is the hardest thing he's ever done, and he sits in that sterile room with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and Jake is quiet now staring at the floor, and Emma is curled into Richard's side hiccuping from crying so hard, and Richard keeps replaying the morning in his head, and he remembers Max barking at the stairs and Max sniffing the baseboards and Max refusing to eat, and every single sign was there, and Richard ignored all of them because he was busy, because he trusted his security systems, because he thought he had everything under control, and now his dog might die because of that arrogance, and guilt settles into his chest like a stone and he doesn't know how to move it. An hour passes and then 2, and the vet finally comes out and she explains that the antivenom was administered in time and Max is stable, but the next few hours are critical and the venom did damage, but Max is fighting and dogs like Max are fighters, and Richard almost breaks down right there in the waiting room, but he holds it together for the kids and they wait some more, and Jake falls asleep against the armrest, and Emma finally stops crying, and around midnight the vet comes back with the first real smile of the night, and she says Max is going to make it and recovery will take time, but he's going to be okay, and Richard feels the weight lift and he closes his eyes, and for the first time all day he lets himself cry just a little, just enough. 3 days later Max comes home and he's weak and his neck is bandaged and he walks slowly, but when he sees Jake and Emma waiting at the front door his tail wags, and it's not a strong wag but it's there, and Emma drops to her knees and wraps her arms around him so gently, and Jake kneels down too and buries his face in Max's fur, and Richard stands behind them watching, and something in him shifts permanently because he realizes that all his money and all his success and all his security systems meant nothing in that moment, and what saved his children was loyalty, pure and simple and unconditional, and Max didn't calculate the risk and Max didn't weigh the options, and Max just moved because that's what love does, and Richard kneels beside them and puts his hand on Max's head and whispers, "You took it for them," and Max looks up at him with those tired golden eyes, and in that look Richard sees something he will never forget, and it changes him. In the weeks that follow Richard makes changes, and not just to the house, although he does hire wildlife experts to inspect every inch of the property and seal every possible entry point, but the bigger changes are quieter and more personal, and he starts working from home more, and he cancels meetings that used to feel important, and he sits on the floor with the kids and Max in the evenings, and he watches and he listens, and when Max reacts to something now Richard pays attention because he learned the hard way that instincts matter and that sometimes the ones who can't speak are the ones who see the most. And he teaches Jake and Emma too, and he tells them to always respect what Max is telling them because Max proved himself in a way that can never be doubted, and the children understand and they look at Max differently now with a kind of reverence that goes beyond pet and owner, and they know that dog took a bite meant for them and they will carry that knowledge forever. Richard finds himself having conversations with Max late at night when the kids are asleep, and he knows Max doesn't understand the words, but maybe he understands something deeper. And Richard tells him about Sarah and about how scared he was to raise the kids alone, and about how grateful he is that Max came into their lives. And Max just listens with his head on Richard's lap, and sometimes that's enough, and sometimes presence is the only language that matters. The scar on Max's neck heals, but the memory doesn't fade, and every time Richard sees it he remembers that afternoon, and he remembers how close he came to losing everything, and he remembers that a dog with no concept of wealth or status or power did what all his resources could not and protected the people who mattered most. And Richard is a different man now, not because of a business deal or a market shift, but because of a moment of pure selfless love from an animal who asked for nothing in return. And that is the real lesson here, and it's not about money failing or nature winning, and it's about understanding what protection really means, and it's about recognizing that loyalty doesn't calculate and loyalty doesn't hesitate, and loyalty puts itself between danger and the ones it loves without a second thought. Months later, Richard is sitting on the back patio with Max beside him, and the kids are playing in the yard, and the sun is setting over the hill country, and everything is peaceful. And Richard looks at Max, and Max looks back, and there's an understanding between them now. And Richard knows he will never take this dog for granted again, and he knows he will never dismiss instinct again, and he knows that some lessons can only be learned the hard way, and this was one of them. And he's grateful and humbled and changed. Would your dog protect you without hesitation? Think about that for a moment, and think about the bond you share. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who believes that dogs are true guardians, because they are, and Max proved it, and every family is lucky to have a protector like him.